Thank you very much, Madam, and thank you for the very kind introductory statement and presenting me. I'm a bit ashamed, but well, here I stand in front of you. Together, I came to Berlin, well, from different places, but I'm here together with Adina Trunk, and the distribution of labor is that I will give an introduction to the explanation Mrs. Trunk will give about what we think is, at least for our organization, but is also for the whole of the community of stakeholders that are involved in strengthening democracy all over the globe, in different countries and places, a document that should be standard setting, benchmarking, and should be a document in the future that is a very important reference. First of all, thank you very much, dear Mark, for having us here. I don't know where he's sitting currently, but anyway, if he's here physically or in thoughts, thank you very much for inviting us and for giving us the opportunity to explain you a bit more about International IDEA. International IDEA, ladies and gentlemen, is a small, not so big, not really very small, but not so big intergovernmental organization launched 22 to 23 years ago in Stockholm by Nordic Scandinavian ministers of foreign affairs that had the idea that complementary to what was already set up within the UN framework as a landscape of specific organizations, that there was still a loophole. That what was missing was an intergovernmental, so publicly owned organization that would have as the sole mandate to promote democratic governance as the best way to, the most sustainable in the long term way to govern people, to govern citizens, to govern nations. And so in February 95, International IDEA was launched. It's still the only public authority-linked international organization that has the promotion of democratic governance as its mandate. Since 95, the organization has grown. We have now a constituency of 30 member states from all over the globe. Very big democracies like India, Indonesia, for instance. I think 7 or 8 G20 countries are members of International IDEA, but also very small democracies like, for instance, Cabo Verde, Barbados. Our constituency is composed by countries from all over the globe, from, so to say, Peru to Mongolia, from Australia to Canada. And our member states are at different stages of democratic development. Some of the democracies are very deeply rooted since hundreds and hundreds of years. Others came recently to democracy. The origin of the institution also goes back to the implosion of the Soviet Union and the end of apartheid. South Africa was one also of the founding member states. We are currently, as said, not such a big organization, but still we have 200 staff members. We have a budget of something like 25 to 27 million euros, and we basically, in terms of activities, we do 3 things. First of all, we are a research center. Secondly, we act as a convening partner to bring together scientists, academic people, but also practitioners in the field of democracy to exchange best practices, to try to improve processes. So this is the second, I would say, kind of activities we organize. And last but not least, more than half of our energy goes into country programs. So in different places all over the globe, we have teams on the ground that help, based on a kind of consultancy activity, that help public authorities, but also civil society organizations to improve political processes. Some of these places sounds as very familiar. For instance, Myanmar, the transition to democracy in Myanmar is coached, so to say, to a certain extent by International IDEA. Other countries where we are active are including Kenya, Peru, Bolivia, Nepal, Bhutan, Ukraine, the Fiji Islands now we are starting up, Paraguay. So based on donorship by international organizations and some of our main member states, we have teams on the ground there to support activities that have to bring better functioning democracy. We are very typically a do and think tank, so we have lots of colleagues that or think or do. We try to combine both because practice brings good ideas and brings also credibility to scientific work. And on the other hand, to have the enlightenment of scientific research to nurture your real work on the ground is also very interesting. We are specialized in some specific niches of democratic governance. So we try not to duplicate efforts. We don't compete with big organizations like the OSCE, like the Council of Europe, or the UN and UN agencies. We try to identify with our member states some loopholes and try to be world leading in these loopholes, producing research and doing underpinning work for the people active in these fields. The three main aspects of democratic governance where we have specialists in is number one, very important, and that's the reason why we are IDEA, ENA, electoral assistance, is the whole of the electoral processes. Not electoral observation, we don't do electoral observation, but we work a lot on all aspects of electoral processes with the objective to improve the mechanics of free and fair elections. So this is the first pillar of our activity. I can say that in that domain we are really world leading in the activities we work on concerning electoral processes. The second domain where we work in is constitution building. The processes of constitution building for mature, peaceful democracies or for conflict-affected areas. When it comes to agree within a population about the basic principles based on which a democracy is organized, democratic governance is organized, these constitutional principles, well, we try to provide inclusive processes and citizens-owned constitution-building processes because we think this gives more guarantees for quality and also for sustainability in the long run. So this second kind of activity is also very prominent in our organization. There again, we try to be different to colleagues. For instance, you have the Venice Commission that is working on constitution building. They are more focusing on the content of constitution building processes. We are more in advising parliaments, governments to make the process better, to render it, for instance, more inclusive. Last but not least, we are doing a lot of scientific research and activities in the field of what I would call the interaction between citizens and public authorities. So empower people to hold their leaders accountable, organize, professionalize, make civil society function better, the management of political parties. So all what is related to these bunch of interactions that we have between citizens, their organizations and public authorities, there we also invest a lot of time and energy in. So all is aiming at trying to help develop and strengthen the institutions and moreover the culture of democracy. And of course I say very consciously the culture of democracy to kind of make a bridging, to kind of make a bridge to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Indeed, institutions, strengthening institutions, but also work a lot in capacity building and trying to strengthen the culture of democracy, because we think that democracy can only be dynamic, vivid, delivering towards citizens when it is based not only on formal institutions, but also on attitudes and on a culture of democracy. Democracy indeed has to be enshrined in people's values, has to be owned in order to be sustainable, has to be owned by the populations and has to thrive and sustain itself. And we think that culture as such, not so much culture of democracy, but culture as such in that framework can play a very essential role in contributing to that. And I would like to seize the opportunity of speaking to you to take the following minutes to explain you a bit why and how this is the case. Why it is the case that a culture of democracy is as important as, and cultural diplomacy plays an important role in strengthening the democratic practice. This has, of course, to do with the essence of cultural diplomacy, which I would describe as, and I quote, I'm not intelligent enough to invent that myself, but I quote, cultural diplomacy can be described as the exchange of ideas, values, traditions, and other aspects of culture or identity to strengthen intercultural relations, to enhance socio-cultural cooperation, with the ultimate goal of contributing to global peace and stability. And building a bit further on what my predecessor here at the rostrum has said, the Icelandic former minister, I would like to make the link with the SDGs that bring, I think, a very useful framework to position cultural diplomacy and position democratic governance. Indeed, we think, we are convinced, and the international community is convinced that, of course, the ultimate goal of cooperation, of exchanges, of diplomacy should be to contribute to global peace and stability, and this is at the center of the so-called SDGs, the Agenda 2030. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have charted a way forward for the whole of the UN community, for all UN member states to achieve sustainable development, and you know it goes through 17 goals, as they were described, with very precise goals to reach. And we don't have to be too cynical, because the Millennium Agenda, we have seen that lots of these goals in the Millennium Agenda have been reached. So it is possible. We can reach most of these Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And one of them, and to our opinion, it's one of the most, they're all very relevant, but it's one of the most relevant. One of them is the so-called SDG 16, which pursues peace, which pursues justice and strong institutions. We would have preferred to have the D word in SDG, formulated in SDG 16, to have democratic governance as an objective. But based on political dissension, on differences still amongst the representatives of the member states of the UN, at least, this was not possible. But issues like accountability, like public authority exercised based on a mandate, these are kind of, not literally, but are comprised in SDG 16, and that gives us some comfort that fulfilling SDG 16 and pursuing the fulfillment of SDG 16 brings us closer to democracy, and moreover brings us closer to sustainable peace and stability. We indeed think that idea that democratic principles are core to and are also important enablers for the realization of the 2030 agenda. And then we talk about rule of law, about access to justice, accountable and transparent institutions, responsive, inclusive, participatory and representative decision-making, fundamental freedoms. These all are the kind of fundamental cornerstones for achieving the SDGs, at least based on the vision on man and society and on the kind of culture we have in terms of governance based on these values shared by a vast majority of the nations that are member of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to democracy and defining what we are talking about, we use at International IDEA a kind of container definition. Why a container definition? Because we are a very diverse organization with cultural attitudes towards governance and towards democratic governance that differ based on history, based on different experiences, based also on the characteristics of countries and places all over the globe. Anyway, for us, in that container definition, so to say, with a wide scope, two elements are essential. We talk about democracy based on the fact that the exercise of public authority is controlled by, is monitored by citizens. So no public authority can be exercised outside of the control, the final control and monitoring by citizens. This is an essential prerequisite to be able to talk of democracy. And the second very important element at present times is that not only there is that element of the monitoring of the exercise of public authority by citizens, but also the need that in that exercise of that right to control, right to hold accountable the leadership of a country that there, or a municipality or whatever public authority, that in the exercise of that control, citizens should be equal, should have equal access to hold their leaders, to the tools that hold their leaders accountable. So monitoring by citizens and fundamental equality amongst these citizens. But besides that, besides this broad definition, we see that democracy takes many shapes and forms. And that's the reason why we, in our work, are non-prescriptive. The ambition of International IDEA is not to teach the world how to behave from Stockholm. It's not to teach a kind of ideal concept of democracy or an ideal democratic system. No. In our view, a real fully fledged democracy owned by a population has to take into account the reality of the people concerned, of the country concerned. And so you can never put forward a kind of ideal of democracy, a kind of model everybody should follow. We witness that democracy comes in many shapes and forms. And so the second element is that based on that assessment, based on that, let's say, fundamental principle of our action, we also say that sustainable democracy can only be sustainable to the extent it is owned by the people. It is homegrown. It is not brought to the people. So to say it a bit bluntly, we used to say that democracy can never be imported in a country. It can never be exported from another place. It can only be supported. And the triggering, the most important element is whether the people themselves, the citizens themselves, in a very free way, own these democratic principles that lead to democratic governance as defined earlier. And in that framework, cultural diplomacy, having the confrontation of identities and values, have a continuous conversation with the people themselves, with civil society, plays a very important role. And we take that on board in our activities, in our work. I could give different examples, but it is clear that when you're active in such different countries like Mongolia, like Ethiopia, Peru, Bhutan, the Fiji Islands, you have to take into account, in order to be effective, you have to take into account these, let's say, preconditions of the state, of the public authorities where they try to work with. And in order to make this very palpable for people, so that people really feel able to own what we co-develop with them, culture is a very important vehicle. We could give examples of what we do, but for instance, we have set up recently in Haiti an exhibition and an art and democracy competition. We sometimes support projects of participatory theater to encourage, for instance, in conflict-affected areas, young men and women to be engaged in political debates and formal political structures. Through the so-called theater of the oppressed, we have promoted democratic values amongst youth, covering topics as elections, human rights, inclusive participation, as a solution to solving in a sustainable way and in a lasting way inclusive, to solve conflicts and to build up inclusive participation. Let me then come to the second part of my introductory remarks, and it's the kind of privilege I have today to introduce the Global State of Democracy publication, and to introduce to you the work done by Adina Trunk. Indeed, the difference between me and Adina Trunk, amongst all other aspects, is that I'm talking about something she has been doing, which gives more credibility to her latest statement this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, we would like to present to you our new flagship publication, The Global State of Democracy. The real title is The Global State of Democracy Report, Exploring Democracy's Resilience. Publication which provides a kind of health check of democracy worldwide. We think it is an important publication for us, of course, an institution. When I came to the leadership of International IDEA from the OECD, I thought that to give more visibility to our work, it was important, like other organizations, to work at a standard-setting benchmarking publication study for our domain, for our sector, be it that it is a very wide scope of activities. Democracy is not such a thing like health or like education. At the OECD, we worked on lots of reports on the state of education worldwide, on at the PISA research, for instance. Democracy is a bit more complicated, but still our ambition was and is, through this publication, to have a kind of objective, not produced by an NGO with due respect, but by an IGO, by an intergovernmental organization, a public authority linked organization, to have a kind of state-of-the-art standard setting and benchmarking overview of the state of play of democratic governance worldwide. We have made a bit, to that extent, a bit of a different report compared to other ones, and it's already quite a crowded field. You have, for instance, the Freedom House rankings, you have the Bertelsmann Transformational Index, so you have also the yearly report by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. So it's already quite or the Transparency International report, so there is already quite a crowded field of documents, of reports that are focusing on aspects. Our ambition was and is, and thanks to the support of Sweden and Norway, I think we have delivered a good product, is to have a comprehensive overview of where we are. I would add that the first edition also gives statistics, figures, analysis, evaluation of the developments in the field of democratic governance during the last 40 years, which is quite an ambitious goal, but I think we have met the goal. So it means that all events in 75 have been translated in statistics and figures and in our evaluation and analysis, including, as I mentioned before, this convergence with the implosion of the Soviet system, the end of apartheid, the rise of populism. So all these elements are comprised in the study we present today. Very importantly, we try to do two things. Number one is to underpin all our findings on a very vast set of statistics. For the people that will, and Adina will explain later, will go into the substance via our website or via the publication. I think there are some copies of the summary available here. You will see that we have been working based on thousands and thousands, hundred thousands of statistics provided by organizations like VIDEM and others. And based on these statistics, we have weighed, so to say, the value of democracy in each of the countries concerned, declining, translating the concept of democratic governance in 5 what we call attributions that then are also translated in 16, let's say, quantitative, well, where it's possible to have a quantitative approach, 16 criteria to weigh the quality of democracy. But Adina will explain you more. This goes about, well, starting from the definition I gave you about democracy, this goes about, well, democracy has to see with checks on government, to what extent and in what way, and based on what kind of quality of the work the government is controlled, impartial administration, the respect for fundamental rights, rule of law, participatory engagement. So these are all measured, and based on these statistics, we have been able to weigh the quality of democracy on a national level, on a regional level, and worldwide, and this is described in the study. Besides that, we have not only the quantitative approach, but also we try to do a good evaluation, and in the first edition, so the document we present to you today, we work on the modern democratic backsliding, as opposed to the traditional democratic backsliding where after a period of real democracy suddenly a dictatorship comes in place. We see that now you have a different way of backsliding of democracy through a kind of erosion within the still formally existing democratic structures. Second chapter is about the changing nature of political parties as a way to interact between citizens and leadership, a total shift in cultural approach of democracy based on what I would call personally the kind of Weberization of participatory democracy, where you see a kind of implosion of the traditional organizations that were managing that interaction between citizens and political leadership, for instance, political parties with declining membership and the more prominent role of communication technology, social media, and so on in opinion making. Number 3, the influence of money in politics, corruption, still a very prominent problem. But also issues like inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities and their impact on democracy, or for instance also migration and democracy. So I will stop here. I already spoke too long. I was meant to be a kind of local band to be the, let's say, make you wait for the Rolling Stones. So I start here. This is now the real important statements, key message that will be delivered by Adina Trunk. Adina Trunk is one of the, let's say, 5 to 6 key people in producing the report we have presented last month. So I think it's for all of us here a privilege to listen to Adina and to give her the opportunity to present the work. I would add a little word of comment. Normally, Adina should be staying in her bed today. She's a bit sick, but she nevertheless said, I have to be in Berlin. I don't want to deceive people. So as an introduction to her statement, I would give her a very warm applause and thank her for being here. Thank you very much.